Good morning, everyone, and welcome, especially to our visitors, welcome to Columbia University. I'm David Madigan. I'm Columbia's Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you all and our guest, Her Excellency Marie-Louise Coleiro Preca, the President of Malta. And also her husband, Edgar, has joined us as well. He is right there. Welcome. I would first like to thank the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality, who are co-sponsoring today's event, as well as our moderator, Yasmin Ergis, who will be on the right there, who will be joining us up here, Associate Director of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights here at Columbia. Malta is a small nation. It's a nation I have visited, with a population of just 450,000 people. It is similar in density and geographic area to another slightly closer island, Staten Island, over there somewhere. Statehood came only a half-century ago to Malta, when this ancient land became an independent republic. Yet its relative youth and small size have not spared Malta from having to address the very same problems confronting the world's largest countries. One of the sobering realities of a global society is that the nations of the world are often grappling with the same concerns, yet unfortunately the shared cost of these problems is rarely matched by sufficient coordinated action to overcome them. President Marie-Louise Coleiro Preca is familiar with this reality. Since coming to office, she has dedicated herself to protecting the most vulnerable members of society, driving forward initiatives to reduce child poverty, expand food security, and streamline benefits for the elderly and those suffering from illness or abuse. President Coleiro Preca wrote not long ago that her government stands for a just society, for inclusion, for a dignified social system that gives a helping hand to those in need, and, in turn, instills in them a sense of belonging, a sense of dignity. Those enlightened words are being tested today like never before, in Malta and elsewhere, by the historic migration to Europe that we are currently witnessing. Malta's location at the very middle of the Mediterranean Sea places the nation at the centre of the refugee crisis. Since joining the European Union in 2004, more than 17,000 undocumented migrants have arrived in Malta. And just to put that into perspective, it's a sort of a deceiving number. It might not sound that large, but relative to the population of Malta, that would be the same as having 2.7 million refugees in the United Kingdom. As with most of our humanitarian crises today, discussions about economic and environmental sustainability are of great relevance to the refugee crisis. And the prominence of these issues at the United Nations General Assembly this month is very welcome and timely. Collaborating to meet the present and future needs of our global society is a central project of this year's Assembly and also of this university. In fact, today, our campus is hosting the International Conference on Sustainable Development, whose participants, President Coleiro Preca among them, she spoke this morning, I believe, aim to identify solutions that can support the Sustainable Development Goals in advance of the UN Summit taking place this weekend. These guidelines will replace the Millennium Development Goals, becoming the new global markers for eradicating poverty, combating climate change, and advancing human rights. Here to share her vision and how we can continue to follow the path towards achieving these goals is Her Excellency Marie-Louise Coleiro Preca, President of Malta. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, Columbia faculty, alumni, and students, thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I am honored to participate in this esteemed forum, from which world leaders have throughout the years conveyed strong messages of global vision. My intention is to follow in this tradition in light of the Sustainable Development Goals. My message shall speak most forcefully to the problem of inequality and how this impinges on the fulfillment of true sustainable development. My message concerns those among our human family who are most vulnerable, denied access to equal opportunities from the very beginning. In this, we must acknowledge the complexity of human struggle in the form of contemporary migration and discover how we, as students, as leaders, as policymakers, as one united community, can transform the unfolding situation for the better. It is with great hope for the future of our work that I saw reduced inequalities among the list of agreed Sustainable Development Goals. We must treat this as an invitation, extended to the world community, to uncover the root causes of inequality. We must openly and honestly explore the structural deformations that maintain inequality and the interlocking matrix of oppression that holds so many in subjection. Indeed, inequality is an issue of cross-cutting concern which underpins many of the SDGs. If one were to take a closer look at the goals, the intersectional approach we must apply to our focus on inequality becomes clear, be it in securing the elimination of poverty or achieving gender equality. Poverty is driven by inequality and cannot be addressed without resolving underlying sources of inequality. Inequalities take different forms that are mutually reinforcing, which build barriers that hinder people from the enjoyment of equal opportunities and violate the inherent dignity of the human person. We should all begin our journey through life with equal access to the opportunities, benefits, and responsibilities offered by our societies. These must include access to adequate health care, access to education, and full participation in the reform of those systems that perpetuate processes of division and exclusion in our lives and the lives of our communities. Why must reducing inequality sit at the heart of the post-2015 agenda? The Millennium Development Goals offered a promising start. Millions of people are now spared extreme poverty. Developing regions have seen an increase in primary education enrollment. There is more access to safe sources of water. The rate of HIV infection has fallen. But there is much more than that which must be done. In some ways, there are stronger barriers of inequality that we must now overcome so as to ensure that not one of us is left behind. If we want to live in a more sustainable and peaceful world, we must accept that the insidious reach of inequality affects everyone, not simply those directly afflicted. Definitely, the effects of inequality are not a problem reserved for the excluded and most disadvantaged. Inequality infects the social and cultural fabric of our nations and affects all strata of society. Let's take an example. In an economic context, inequalities translate into reduced economic growth because affected people do not successfully enter the workforce. Once this happens, their potential as workers, innovators, entrepreneurs, and business people is lost. This loss is felt by the entire economy. It ripples throughout society, as the added value they could have brought is practically lost. Inequalities also compromise social cohesion and security. In aggravated cases, it can result in situations of escalated conflict and manifestations of violence. Valuable human lives are put at risk, opportunities are destroyed, and the potential of future generations is compromised. addressing inequalities is imperative, not only because it is the only right thing to do, but because it is a prerequisite for the sustainable and peaceful world we would create together. Although the last few decades have seen significant progress in certain areas of concern, the reality is that a number of inequalities have persisted and enlarged since the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals. In a world enthralled by the force of market-driven economies, certain policies tend to favor the interests of those who already possess a considerable advantage. Oftentimes, this comes at the expense of the poorest and the most marginalized of people, especially where these policies relate to the provision of basic social needs. The restriction of access to natural resources, so vital for survival and economic independence, has also increased. Compounding this, the risks associated with environmental degradation and climate change have become issues of unavoidable concern. The situation has put already disadvantaged communities in a place of increasing precariousness. In some instances, the threats to their survival have become intolerable, pushing them into further isolation and vulnerability. Therefore, the issue of reduced inequalities must always qualify and inform our post-2015 outlook. In real terms, what should be done to reduce inequality, I ask? We must break the cycles of disadvantages, based intergenerational legacies within particular groups and communities. We must break the cycles of reinforcement that foster discrimination and exclusion. Most importantly, we must address the cultural and structural causes of these inequalities and not merely focus, case by case, on symptomatic manifestations. We must ensure that systems of exclusion are replaced by strategies of inclusion. We must set the elimination of inequality as our goal and strive to begin multidimensional social processes that help people to gain control over their own lives. In a post-2015 world, we need to move away from stereotypes and prejudice that fuel inequalities. We need to bring to the fore these elements that prioritize well-being and hope. Where, for example, some may label migrants as intruders and a burden to society, it is our duty to disrupt this damaging discourse and replace it with the reality of added values and opportunities that migrants bring to our societies. To achieve this vision of a new world rooted in equal opportunities, there must be a strong consensus and a strong commitment from the global community. Change must take place on all fronts, a concerted effort enacted on national and international levels. Appropriate policy and legal frameworks that protect the interests of all, including the most vulnerable, must be set up for this transformation to be realistically achieved. And ultimately, these frameworks must be accompanied by a change in social attitudes, a reorientation that embraces the centrality of human rights. It is only within this context that inequality can be reduced and eliminated. By proxy, it is the only way our sustainable development goals can become a reality. It shall be no easy task, because our work presents a challenge to the status quo. It is a challenge to those in power, a demand that they take into consideration the position of others who are denied the privileges they take for granted. Yet, it is only in issuing this challenge and standing firm that we may ever achieve true sustainable development. The fact that reducing inequalities has become an integral part of the SDGs is already a step in the right direction. Furthermore, the goal's numerous targets provide practical guidance on how inequalities can be addressed. These include clear information on the indicators that will be used to measure our success. These targets must be fully endorsed by all member states if we are to stand a better chance of successfully reaching our goals on a global scale. It is time for states to take concrete and comprehensive action within a rights-based approach that tackles economic, social, cultural, political, and environmental considerations. In this way, legislators and diverse actors shall ensure that equality and intersectionally sensitive non-discrimination are entrenched in law, led by the framework of human rights and implemented through policy. Appropriate action is necessary to protect people from discrimination, violence, exploitation, and harm. Essential safeguards need to be in place to counteract threats of violence and unfair economic and financial activities that are especially detrimental to certain communities and groups of people. We must undertake measures to support individuals and groups whose capabilities have been diminished or constrained by the crushing weight of inequalities. Furthermore, states must strengthen the capacity of rights holders to make valid claims so that inequalities and violations are seriously addressed. The role of such mechanisms is essential. We must call on states to enact macroeconomic policies that create appropriate employment opportunities. This is central so as to ensure that new entrants in the labour force are afforded adequate opportunities. It will also provide jobs for the unemployed and move the employment market away from those vulnerable forms of employment dominated by exploitation and degradation. In mitigating the risks of inequalities, states must guarantee basic services, quality education, healthcare, food, sanitation, and social security accessible to all, and without which inequalities will persist and inevitably worsen. The guarantee of basic services goes hand in hand with the provisions of social welfare systems that cater for unexpected adverse situations. These include declines in income due to illness, old age, and other factors. The effective implementation of these measures will ensure that affected persons will not be automatically relegated to a compromised situation due to conditions often out of their direct control. Such measures will in fact empower and assist them, extending a hand of care when it is needed the most. In order to reduce inequalities, states must facilitate free and quality access to information and knowledge, so that everyone may actively participate in their respective political processes. There is an alarming tendency for those suffering inequalities to be unrepresented in political processes that could potentially address and alleviate their oppression. As a result, their concerns are not given the importance they deserve. This ties in with the importance of decentralized governance. Strengthening the capacity of local governments will facilitate the provision of policies that apply to local and regional situations in a direct and concentrated manner. This will help alleviate area-specific situations of concern with the added value of providing local solutions that foster local participation. This encourages participation by all groups, including those affected by inequalities, presenting platforms from which they may speak the truth in a place of mutual respect. This is an excellent way in which we may make the post-2015 framework relevant at all levels. Special consideration needs to be given to those countries where governance has been weakened. These include conflict and post-conflict countries, where the building of government capacity at all levels needs to be prioritized in extended programs of peace building and recovery. Inequalities are very real in such contexts, and as such need to be highlighted because of the increased precariousness faced by vulnerable groups and communities. An overarching dimension that connects these remarks is the need for accountability, namely the ways in which policymakers and governments are held to account for the design, monitoring, and implementation of policies. Accountability is essential if we are to ensure that adequate action is taken by those who have a duty to implement functioning frameworks that protect and defend the rights of all. In essence, the onus falls on states endorsing those goals in a shared commitment to reduce inequalities. States have the capacity to do so, and also have the obligation to do so. By implementing carefully orchestrated constellations of policy and reform, states will be fulfilling their mandates in providing the best for all their people, while also acting in accordance with their international legal obligations. The international community and civil society have a role to play in highlighting developments that aggravate inequalities. For example, by actively participating in the Universal Periodic Review process, the international community and civil society can both play key roles in making sure that we all progress along one path, united towards achieving our SDGs. When focusing on the symptoms rather than the cause, states often adopt policies that address immediate situations through short-term objectives rather than developing long-term strategies to address underlying inequality. Policymakers are thus called to keep mindful of the economic, social, and cultural aspects of inequality that impede lasting progress. We must remember that many people affected most keenly from inequality also suffer from highly disadvantaged starting points in life. This is a barrier to the development of their full potential and their ability to access and harness opportunities. It is therefore crucial that the states endorsing the SDGs take adequate action to acknowledge and address these compounded difficulties. In my work within the community, I am in constant contact with the lived experience of inequality. This is a reality of global proportions, and no country is spared. Situations might change from one nation to the next, or from one continent to the other, but the bottom line remains the same. Inequality continues to exist at the expense of the many who are directly affected and to the detriment of the whole community. One of the major forms of inequality that has huge impact on our societies is without doubt income inequality and the resulting risk of poverty. As economies emerge from a particularly difficult period, we must take this opportunity to reflect on the measures adopted by governments and their effects on people. In Europe, 1 in 4 Europeans is at risk of poverty and/or social exclusion. This translates into millions of people struggling to make ends meet. This is particularly worrying because inequalities in income and the radically asymmetric distribution of wealth and resources often leads to other, sometimes more subtle, inequalities. Indeed, inequalities in income may also themselves be a consequence of other inequalities and experiences of oppression. In this respect, poverty and inequality are intimately correlated. Oftentimes, poverty is common among people who belong to communities and groups that are subject to discrimination and prejudice. Furthermore, the efforts of poverty, like homelessness, are shown to lead to compounded forms of discrimination. Fortunately, there is a growing recognition that the current scale of inequality is simply unsustainable. Long-term unemployment rates and the rise in poverty linked with austerity measures are being replaced by a recognition that strategic social investment must be made. To reduce this kind of inequality, investment must safeguard the future of citizens worldwide, an investment in the social realities of each and every community. In such an analysis, we must also focus on related matters, such as the gender pay gap. This difference in salary for the same kind of job is a reflection of ongoing discrimination and inequalities in the labor market, which manifests disturbing and deeply embedded cultural prejudice. It affects a huge number of women worldwide and is a problem that afflicts even our most advanced economies. It must be remembered that women play a vital role in employment and economic growth. We bring talents and a set of skills that are necessary for the provision of the sustainable development under discussion today. By undervaluing women's work and the contributions of women, the whole economy loses out. Closing the gender gap will also help women enjoy better pensions, an important factor to keep in mind, especially when discussing the likelihood of elderly women experiencing poverty in old age. By closing the gender gap, we shall send a strong message, a hopeful call for social justice. The feminization of poverty reflects a huge injustice, one of the most worrying forms of inequality faced today. Policymakers must keep in mind that these women caught in the cycle of poverty often lack the necessary access to change their situation. Their efforts to provide for their families and communities go unrewarded and unrecognized. Their situation is further compounded by limited or no access to resources such as credit, land, or inheritance. The empowerment of these women is therefore a priority that the international community cannot ignore if it is serious about achieving a sustainable future for all. Gender equality in all its forms is a fundamental goal of development. This must also include the equality of gender minorities, shifting the power of gender self-determination into the hands of the individuals. However, in many places around the world, these various targets are yet to be achieved. We must recognize that issues of gender are strongly linked with our goals and will have tremendous effects on the overall success of the SDGs. Even if progress has been made, the fact is that women and girls continue to occupy a disadvantaged position throughout the world. This inequality is not limited to location or to whether the situation occurs in poor households or in developing countries. Discrimination occurs in situations of conflict and also in places of ostensible peace. Reports continuously show that a large inequality trend persists worldwide. It affects a wide range of rights, including health, education, employment, and access to justice. In practical terms, this means that half of the world's population suffers from a diminished social status and does not enjoy all its rights. Half of the world's population suffers reduced freedom and diminished dignity. In looking at a more equal future, free from inequalities, we must all recognize that gender inequality negatively affects those who identify as men as well as women. The road towards gender equality needs to be viewed not merely as a transfer of opportunities from one group to another, but as an opportunity for all to enjoy their rights. In this respect, the role of men and boys is important in promoting true gender equality. As some of you know, I've been chosen by UN Women to convey this message through the HeForShe campaign as one of 10 heads of states that have endorsed this campaign and are determined to make a difference. Together with other global leaders, I've joined the HeForShe Solidarity Movement for gender equality. In essence, we shall engage men and boys as agents for change, motivated to become advocates for gender equality. The campaign encourages men and boys to speak out and take appropriate action against inequalities faced by women and girls, with a concurrent awareness of the struggles faced by gender minorities. I'm happy to announce here that the HeForShe Malta campaign will be officially launched in the beginning of October. Community leaders, representatives from the business sector, academics, sportsmen and men from different walks of life have joined our campaign to deliver a message of equality. I hereby commend UN Women for this powerful initiative and congratulate all those who have joined this campaign worldwide. Together, we can reduce inequalities and create a world that reflects our hard-won values. A key message of the campaign is that gender equality is not an issue faced by women or gender minorities alone. It is a human rights issue that affects us all, from which we all stand to benefit. Gender equality liberates us from the dual chains of privilege and oppression, from prescribed social roles and the gender stereotypes of a binary system that must be interrogated and transformed. These are days of great importance, not only for us here in New York, close to the action, but also for the rest of the 7 billion people that make up our human family. In the decades to come, we'll be judged by future generations on the eventful choices we make together today and on the commitments we undertake. We will be judged on how many people were elevated from poverty, on better access to healthcare, on the improved availability of water and sanitation, on the provision of sustainable economic growth, and on the action we take in response to climate change, and on our efforts to secure just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. The results we seek to ensure will be put under scrutiny and will be assessed in terms of progress made. These goals will continue building on what has been achieved by the Millennium Development Goals. They will focus more energy and more resources on the needs of the most vulnerable. They will help us move forward, kindling a spirit of strengthened global solidarity with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all peoples. To me, the focus on the poorest and the most vulnerable is the crux of this momentous event. These include people on the move, particularly asylum-seeking migrants. When comparing the goals we agree to against the main push and pull of migration factors, it is evident that the two are strongly linked. Migration is fueled by inequality and poverty, lack of food and water security, economic factors such as employment, lack of sustainable practices, climate change, conflict and wars. These are all reflected in our work, and it is indeed a special moment to see all stakeholders join together to care for the most vulnerable amongst us, especially migrants. Migration is a cross-cutting issue in the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. The economic, social, and environmental dimensions all impinge on migration. And this is why any discourse on sustainable development must include migration as a cornerstone. It is with great satisfaction that I see this concern included in the development goals, and I commend everyone involved for having the courage and the vision to acknowledge this from the standpoint of human rights. The adoption of post-2015 agenda will undoubtedly make headlines throughout the world. Nonetheless, those same headlines will also include grim stories about migrants and their often thwarted journey in search of better lives. News bulletins in Europe report on the horrific loss of human life on a near daily basis. Human rights are all too often sidelined and ignored. Something must be done. The Mediterranean region and mainland Europe are now facing an unprecedented situation, a turning point which could mean a new beginning for so many, or a tragic end for countless people. Over the past decades, the Mediterranean and European regions have experienced a growing influx of migrants. Some seek asylum from violence and unrest. Some are economic migrants looking for a better future for themselves and children. There are many factors that influence these migration flows, but the bottom line remains the same. The opportunities that exist in Western societies offer hope of a better life. For some, they offer the promise of life itself. Underlying these opportunities are strong economies that generate jobs and create prosperity. Countries come together to form free trade areas, economic partnerships, and shared trade policies. These partner countries realize it is imperative that barriers between one and another are eliminated, and that policies which encourage collaboration and an unhindered flow of trade are accepted as the best way forward. This outlook has proved largely successful. It creates economic growth, promotes development, strengthens trust between and ties with trading partners, and impacts positively on the day-to-day lives of people and businesses. It positions these economies as some of the biggest and most influential global players in international trade and investment. It is also seen as a way out of economic crises, delivering lower prices, greater consumer choice, and ultimately a higher standard of living. This economic reality, unhindered and free, without barriers or borders, a success on so many fronts, is nonetheless in stark contrast with policies on migration. Policies on migration adopted by these same Western societies are based on a markedly different set of principles. Indeed, existing migration policies seek to hinder and stop this collective sense of cooperation and mutual benefit for all. Instead of reflecting policies that promote free trade and an open economy, migration policies crush all hopes of freedom. This is an essential point which I wish to share with you today. And I ask, why are we failing to recognize that migration can be a positive process, adding particular value? Why are we failing to adopt migration policies that facilitate the movement of people rather than restrict them? Why are we building walls instead of building bridges? Human migration has always played a part in the story of our world. It will always exist because of humankind's ongoing impact on our planet. However, it is up to us to influence the way we deal with migration and the policies our governments choose to adopt. These policies must be rooted in fundamental rights, linked with economic and trade policies that affirm and celebrate the spirit of UN covenants. The demographic change that is underway in many Western societies is one example of the kind of issues that governments must increasingly take into consideration. For instance, in Europe, there are real concerns that there will not be enough workers with the right set of skills to replace people approaching retirement. Striving for the full potential of workers by closing the gender gap and improving labor market outcomes are important elements of any policy response to an aging population. It is key that these intersectional concerns are also open to an awareness of migration. Research and statistics constantly illustrate the fact that migration boosts the working age population. They also show that many migrants arrive with skills that facilitate substantial contributions to human capital development. In the context of the labor market, migrants also play vital roles in both declining and fast-growing sectors of the economy. In essence, migrants not only help through their taxes and social contributions, but they also contribute significantly to labor market flexibility. The facts paint a very different picture from the distorted viewpoints some political actors have us believe. Some of these actors choose to capitalize on people's anxieties and spread deliberate misinformation so as to incite hatred and instill fear. Understanding the true impact of migration is crucial if we are to debate the topic in a constructive and fruitful way. Such debates are imperative because they help shape the design of policies directly engaging with processes of migration. We need to bear in mind that a right-based commitment must uphold the dignity of migrants throughout the world. This is the overarching reality that policymakers, governments, and all stakeholders must respect, and that must guide us during any debates or policy formulation. We must reflect on the lessons learned from economic and trade policies, namely the need for collaboration, partnership, facilitated movement, and no trade borders or barriers. We must think of how these have resulted in great prosperity for us. We have been liberal in our policies regarding trade and economy. We must now be just as generous with people's lives. We must come to imagine a world where migrants are embraced rather than pushed away. Once this is achieved, we may truly nurture a world where peace and well-being can thrive. We'll be in a position to civilly discuss our differences in societies that celebrate diversity and opportunities for all humanity. Together with my Foundation for the Well-being of Society and academic partners, I'm in the process of establishing an institute for peace and well-being, through which these outcomes shall be studied, facilitated, and promoted. I invite you all to join us in this initiative and the exciting research which it shall carry out in our European Mediterranean region. Dear friends, as you have surely gathered by now, I am truly concerned about the effects of inequality and about how we may further the well-being of every one of us, especially those who are most marginalized and most vulnerable. I am concerned that the rights of the few often impinge on the rights of the many. I am concerned about the vicious circles of oppression produced by inequality and how those already at a disadvantage seem trapped with no hope of freedom. As a leader, it is not acceptable for me to do nothing in the face of these problems. We cannot ignore this loss of human potential, this loss of opportunities, this loss of dignity, and even of life. We cannot ignore the plight of individuals and families as they migrate in search of a better life. We cannot ignore the cries of those victims of gender inequality as they continue to suffer injustices. We cannot continue to push the already marginalized groups further away and ignore the shared humanity that binds us. That is why we must have strong hopes for the future for these Sustainable Development Goals. We have come together to endorse a collective vision for a world that promises transformation and renewal. Today, we all share a vision of a future that is inclusive, a vision of the future that restores hope and offers the promise of fulfillment. I encourage you to be active in supporting this vision and to join the efforts of your civil society in urging policymakers to adopt approaches that safeguard human dignity and encourage mutual respect. Finally, I am confident that through our collective efforts, we'll produce sustainable peace and substantive well-being in our nations, our communities, and for each and every one of us. Thank you.
I want to thank Her Excellency for a really extraordinary speech, one that has taught us how you put together human rights and development, passion, and I think a very clear vision. And I'm just delighted and moved by your words. I'd like to open it up now today for questions. Just a few ground rules. There are 2 mics. We'd like you to line up on each side. Please, each person can ask 1 question, and I really would like it to be a question and brief, because we don't have much time, but we do have an extraordinary opportunity for this dialogue. So, so please just take your advance to the microphones. When you do ask your question, please also we'll ask you to identify yourself. In the meantime, I thought I might ask a question to Her Excellency, which is, this is an amazing vision that you've laid out. And I just wonder where you think are our main possibilities for leveraging change. What are the resources that we can have beyond agreement on some general goals, which are very important, in order to make these changes come about?
Well, really and truly, the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be embraced by everyone, hopefully at the UN Summit. These will have to be taken into our countries, each and every country. We need to evaluate what each and every one of us can do. But then we need to go also on the levels of regions and inter-regions, so that really we can bring the whole vision together. It is not something which should be a statement left at an international community level and stops there. But each and every country needs to feel the responsibility of carrying what can be carried within that country. But I see more than that. I believe in each and every one of us, and especially you, young people. This is your world more than mine. You need to help out, stand up, speak up of the aspirations, help out, press what you need to do, what needs to be done by our policy actors, by all the stakeholders. Don't be armchair critics, because that will get you nowhere. So do stand up. So I see that each and every one of us, wherever we may be, whatever our responsibility could be, there's something we have to do to make these SDGs effective, implemented, to really bring about a whole transformation for our globe, for all the peoples of our planet.
Thank you very much. And we'll start with the first question. We really do have only a few minutes, so if you would just briefly state your name and ask your question.
Sure. Well, thank you for your presentation, Mr. President. My name is Brian DeBono, and I'm associated with the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences here. My question is about equal access to undeveloped, pristine land in Malta. Because of Malta's population density, there really just isn't much countryside left anymore. One of the biggest and most pristine areas is in the eastern part of Gozo, which is Malta's second island. The locals love this area and wish to protect it against future development, but developers, specifically associated with the Owl Creek project, continually threaten this area, and unfortunately the government of Malta often seems to support the developers over the wishes of the locals who wish to keep the area as an equal access countryside for all Maltese and all visitors. Like, what would be your perspective on this area?
Well, one thing which, first of all, I must hail one of my countrymen, being I never thought I would find, I thought there is only one Maltese student in Columbia University, so I'm very pleased to see you here. Really pleased to see you here.
Thank you, Madam President.
Well, yes, environment in its totality in our country is an issue, as it is in many countries, but space is truly an issue to a small-sized country like ours. There is a side which you have overlooked. There's a strong civil society standing up for the environment now. And being a politician for a long time in my life, for about 40 years out of my 56 years, I know how politicians think. People have to stand up for that, because politicians think of votes and being popular. So the one very good thing that is happening in Malta too is that we have a very strong civil society for the environment. So my hopes are very high. Brian.
Thank you.
And on this side, please.
Madam President, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Hunter Stiers. I'm in Columbia College. While the European Union is one of the great pillars of the free world and the liberal international order, the past 5 years have seen the ascent of far-right populist political parties to positions of power in an alarming number of EU member states. What do you believe should be done in Europe to address this challenge to the European concept and to the hopeful cooperative agenda embodied in this year's Sustainable Development Goals?
Thank you.
Okay, yes. I think there has been some quite bold writing on the wall in Europe, which we were rather either ignoring or really not seeing. Because the issue of the far-right part is gaining ground. We have seen it happening in the last European Parliament elections. It was very, very clear then. And during my contribution here, I mentioned the issue of at risk of poverty and social exclusion in Europe. 1 in 4 Europeans fall under this group. And where there is disadvantaged groups, and the disadvantaged group which is growing and growing, then tensions are there. And I believe that the issue with regards to the far-right parties, etc., is coming from such tensions. Obviously, compounding that is the issue of migration and the way we speak of migration. Unfortunately, quite a number of us instill fear. We thrive on information and misinformation, and that compounds on a sense of helplessness, a sense of desperation. And from such situations, then what you have mentioned thrives. This is how I explain the situation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we'll be able to take 2 more questions. Sorry about that, but I need to respect everybody's time here. So yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. I'm an undergraduate in CC, Columbia College. My question is, in your presentation, you focused a lot on expanding and empowering women's access to healthcare and education to really close the gender pay gap and empower women to create change in society. In that formulation, do you include access to abortion, which remains illegal in Malta?
No, I don't include that. No, I don't include that. I can't see abortion bringing in quality of life for a community or for a people. No.
Thank you.
Please.
I'll be quick. Thank you for coming, Madam President. Camila Daria Rivera Vizcherka, studying here at Columbia College. Now, in continuation of the gentleman in front of me's question, the European Union, especially from France and Germany, is pushing for these minority quotas, and there's a strong pullback from countries such as Hungary. Do you think it's right and proper for the European Union to fill these quotas, or do you think that, Hungary should get a pass on these kinds of issues?
I believe that every member state should show their responsibility. one has to commend Germany and France for taking the lead and showing and leading by example. And I think the issue goes much further than Europe. The situation of migration flows now coming, the numbers are biblical numbers, really unprecedented situation. And I think it is when we're dealing with the issue of quotas, migrants at this point in time, we're only dealing with the immediate crisis. There, we need to look at the root problem of such a crisis. On the other hand, every time we deal with the migration issue, many a time we lose sight of human rights. Because the migration issue is based in human rights. Human rights are not something, they are not rights which are for Europeans or for Western societies, but they are for all. And every time we ignore giving asylum to people seeking asylum, we are truly going against one of our very basic fundamental human rights. So first of all, I see all member states, they should show the responsibility, not just responsibility within the European Union, but also responsibility towards our human rights. Because the migrants issue is a human rights-based issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Might I ask
Okay.
you if you would like to say a few words in closing?
All right. Well, just to say thank you, really, it was a very good experience. I would have liked to have more time, not to speak from a podium, but to come down there and find an informal manner how we can discuss. That would have been much better for me. I would have felt much more in the best moments. These are the best moments when I'm discussing on the same level. But really, I owe you success in your endeavors. There's a lot of responsibility with these SDGs. And as I appealed before, it is not just the politicians, policy actors, or all the other stakeholders, but it's all of us. We have a responsibility to make these SDGs be implemented and have the effects that many of us at least, or most of us desire, to have a peaceful, harmonious world for each and every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much.
I have another meeting. I have another meeting with...
Ladies and gentlemen, please stay in your seats as we escort the President and her delegation out of the building. Thank you.